One thing about a couple of technical co-founders is that you had relatively similar skill sets. So there wasn't an obvious division initially. We had to make a decision, all right, who's going to focus on sales and who's going to continue to focus on technology?
I think it was even more of a high risk moment in our company's history. We had something like 8 months of runway in the bank, and we were essentially planning to completely change the company.
Welcome to How I Met My Co-Founder, the podcast where entrepreneurs share raw stories behind how their founding teams met, built trust, and navigated conflict. I'm your host and team relationship expert, Annie Garofalo, and here's your all-access pass into the conversations that can make or break a founding team. Today, we're joined by Jason and Brian, our first professor-student duo. Back in 2014, the two met at University of Michigan, where Jason was a professor in robotics and computer science, and Brian was pursuing his PhD. Over the past 7 years, Jason and Brian have grown Voxel51 into a successful AI company, with $12 million in funding, a team of over 25, and over 2 million downloads of their open source toolkit enabling better data and better models. What drew me to them was not only their unique faculty-student dynamic, but also the fact that they successfully navigated something we rarely see in founding teams, the CEO title swap. I'll turn it over to them to kick us off with the story of how they met.
I met Brian when I was teaching a computer vision course. Brian was sitting in the front of the classroom the whole time. So Brian was not my PhD student. He is actually the PhD student of a good friend of mine, Raj. But we stayed in touch over the years. We reconnected, I don't know exactly, maybe like 2 years later.
I have another maybe distinctive moment in my memory. We were sitting in the back of some talk, and you mentioned to me that there was this grant that you were considering doing, and that there's an opportunity to do it not as a traditional research-based grant through the university, but maybe doing it as an LLC, what turned out, which kind of really kickstarted the discussions in earnest about, wait a minute, there's an opportunity to do more than just auto grade homework assignments or work on research projects together, which we had also done here and there during that time.
Yes, I think you're right. And how green we were, or at least I was. I mean, I had worked in industry mostly as a consultant, but more than like your typical faculty member, but I had never done a real startup, at least not in a leadership role. So I had no idea what I was getting into.
Fortunately for both of us, it didn't really immediately turn into a startup, right? Because what we first did was worked on a grant together, working on sort of applied research for very interesting projects. But the idea that there was something there that should become a company and which should be funded by venture capitalists and so on, we had a few years to figure it out, I guess, on the fly. One of the things that I think I learned is that if you're a couple of technical founders and you're given the opportunity to just nerd out on cool tech, that's good fun. And we both enjoyed that. And we had the opportunity to learn a lot about our market and what we're ultimately going after today. But if we had the goal from the beginning to start a company, maybe it wasn't the most efficient way to get there.
It sounds like that grant really allowed you to have a smooth transition from academia and experimentation into, okay, what could this look like as a startup? Not only from a technical perspective, not only from a business and market perspective, but also from an interpersonal perspective. During that time, what were you looking for in each other in terms of the interpersonal or relationship side of this venture building journey?
It's an interesting question because, at least from my perspective, there was a history over the course of a couple of years before we decided to work on the grant together. But I wouldn't say that I personally put as much thought as maybe one would into whether or not we were the right long-term partners, because it was a relatively lower risk thing to continue doing a project that felt kind of similar to projects we did in the past. And so indeed, we did get to learn more about each other during those first couple of years. And I think it was more of like a steady decision that actually we can work well together. And we navigated the sort of initial trials of doing something new. As an example, there was a Geographic challenge. I had actually moved to Seattle, and so we were working remotely. And so there was maybe opportunities to focus on other things, but that didn't happen for both of us. So we kind of passed the first test that once we had gotten started together, we found that life after partnering was better than maybe it could have been. And so that was a confirmation.
I think that resonates with my recollection and how we went about it. Really, I'm not averse to leaping into things I don't fully understand either. In the sense that made sense to try it out with the initial grant. An important aspect of our relationship, or kind of the way we've run this enterprise together, like we kind of had to dispose of the notion of like faculty member or past accomplishments and students, and because essentially they have no place, right? You can't hold any errors when you are learning something new together and really, really building it out from the ground up. And that was like a key element to the way we structured our interaction and, sort of trust building and so on. Internally, we describe it as leadership by committee. Most decisions we've worked through, most processes we've worked through have been through discussion. And in the end, they tend to, well, we're still here and we're doing pretty well. We, more than 2 million downloads, I think, something like that, right, of our software. And I would definitely think that's a really critical role to, probably in any startup, right? Like, obviously, more often than not, people have different backgrounds when they come together to form a startup. Brian and I have pretty similar backgrounds. So there's even more, in other cases, more inclination to like divide and conquer. But I think it's worked out pretty well that we didn't really divide and conquer too much. And maybe we went a little slower at certain times, right? But I think we were pretty methodical and pretty careful about what we did. And it's worked out pretty well.
It sounded like your team dynamic from the get-go is that you're both very involved in the company. And I've worked with other teams where there are different levels of experience and different backgrounds, and that has changed how they get involved even from day one, with maybe one person being more execution focused, one person being more strategy focused. Do you feel like from when you started working together in the grant, did you have a conversation to say, this is our team dynamic? Did you fall into it? How did you figure out that that's what worked for you?
Yeah, early on, like Jason mentioned, one thing about, a couple of technical co-founders is that you had relatively similar skill sets in the universe of possible founder pairs. And so there wasn't an obvious division initially of, well, one person's going to focus on go-to-market, one person's going to focus on tech, right? So as a result, we were learning together in a way that helped us stay very much in sync. Now, as we started scaling the company, we had to make a decision, all right, who's going to focus on sales and who's going to continue to focus on technology? So that was a decision we made. Jason was our first salesperson, quite successful at it, I might add, although it wasn't maybe his natural inclination. And I focused on the technology. That decision was something we discussed and it made sense for us to do. But, we maintained the close communication, I would say, at the company level to make sure that we were learning together, right? Because after all, we're both first-time founders and there's plenty of new learnings, and there wasn't some sort of pool of past experience that we could pull from specifically to make business decisions. As a result, a lot of the tough decisions or unknowns that we were presented with around, should we make a pivot, or what should our strategy be to sell the product, bottoms up, top down, whatever. Those were decisions that we had to make together, basically, because we were learning it on the fly, which I felt was enjoyable, actually, to have somebody to go through that with, right? Because you're dealing in gray areas and unknowns and developing your intuition.
Totally agree. And I think an underlying emphasis is, at least for founders, is like a fundamental need or willingness to kind of like grunt and bear, do what it takes. You may not know about product marketing or sales for that matter or whatever, right? And it's probably not the right thing to do in your first couple of years of the company to go hire a salesperson. Probably a bad idea. So as a founder, you know the space the best, the product the best, and so on. You really have to like do what it takes to kind of get the job done. And I think we were both kind of willing to do that along various axes at various times. We've joked over the time that there's definitely a book in like what to do as a pair of technical founders when you're starting a company.
Yeah. I just love your mentality of that flexibility and adjusting on the fly and being so open to changing, whether that is on a pivot, a strategic pivot, or even your team structure. I think something that's really unique about your team is the different roles that both of you have held over time. So specifically, I'm thinking about the transition from Jason, you going from CEO to CSO, and Brian, you going from CTO to CEO. I'm curious, how did those conversations happen? I know you mentioned there's the phrase you like to use, leadership by committee. How did that play out in those types of conversations?
In the initial case, we tended to default to what seemed natural, in some sense, right? So the older guy got the CEO role with the gray hair because he was going to be the salesperson anyway. And, but I think over time, we tended to align our committee discussions, if you will, through, along at least a couple axes, right? Like, okay, what does the individual want and need? And then really what does the company want and need in that moment? As the first salesperson of the company, like I enjoy talking to people. I enjoy talking about the product. I enjoy learning about all the problems that people had, but it wasn't necessarily unlocking my superpower, right? Like actually at Voxel51, we often talk about like, what is your superpower? Like, what is like the thing you can do best to bring value to the people around you and the company? And with a 20-year career in academia that I still, partially maintain, like it seemed like the best way to unlock like the need to build out our community trust and our foundational technology from a scientific standpoint would be best for the company going forward when we're thinking about making the transition over the last couple of years. And at the same time, I think Brian was very interested in org building in a way that I wasn't as interested in org building. And I think that would really help to enable that interest to germinate and build over time.
And I think a key thing about what Jason was saying is that this was a transition that we had planned over the course of many months, right? We've had some discussions about, hey, this is what we've learned about our interests in the company. We're thinking about strategy for the company and looking ahead at what types of activities we needed to do, whether it was to build, take off some of the hats that we're wearing, build a sales team, build a marketing team, and so forth, right? And as we started putting together like what we learned we were specifically interested in and passionate about at the company, together with what we needed to do, it kind of made sense for us to change roles for the next phase of growth in the company. Because one thing that I've definitely learned is that there's never time to sort of sit back and give yourself credit for a job well done, because you just enabled the next set of growth and challenges and everything's going to change again, right? Because after all, in the universe of companies, a team of 30 people is still tiny compared to what it's going to be in the future if you continue to execute. So it's always a good time to take stock of the new learnings we've developed about our interests and skills and what the company needs, right? Which maybe is neither of us to do that role. Maybe it's time to bring on an expert to lead that area.
I really like that adaptation based on the needs of you as individuals and leaders and your company. There is an element of psychological safety and trust that is required in order to have those conversations in an effective way, to bring in your individual needs and to make asks or recommendations about changes. How do you think about the circumstances that allow you to have those conversations productively?
So I think we're lucky that we are pretty similar in nature, right? Like, because I think that helped us, at least the brick wall that prevents some conversations like that was a little lower. But I think these were not like, don't get at least me wrong. These were non-trivial conversations, right? Like you're proposing, like, I think what I need is X, and I recognize that it's going to potentially upset the temporary balance we've established, but overall, I think it's better for the long run. That is a non-trivial thing to do in almost any environment. Side note, like I pick like annual themes for my own personal growth, and my theme for last year, 23, was conflict. I knew that this was something I was going to bring to the forefront of my personal growth in the company. And it was not until like halfway through, I think like the following year, really, where this ultimate came to a fruition. So it was non-trivial, but I think it's your responsibility to express your needs and not rationalize, but then like kind of marry those needs with the overall organizational needs. Because sometimes you have to, your own needs need to wait. Like I think that's also natural in any job or any organization, really. But you have to have a plan, right? There's no plan, to affect those needs. Then I think that's where the problem comes in, and that's where you kind of get disgruntled and so on. So I think we worked to build a plan and ultimately have executed it over time.
There was an analogy that was told to me by an advisor of ours that really stuck with me. He said, think of founders, and I would also say the founding team of a company, like family. Now, if you're thinking about like your company in general, it may be a mistake to treat people like family and expect family-like behavior when in fact it's a profession. There's a sense in which a team is different from a family. But I think for founders, that's a good analogy because there's some shared history and origin story there. And, the good thing about, but maybe the bad thing about family is you can't get rid of them no matter what you do, right? But it's a helpful starting place to think about like interactions for better or for worse. There's a common history there. And if you start with a given that, some sort of separation is off the table, then I think it can be a helpful jumping off place to remember that there's always a place, for family members in a story, although the situation may change.
I think that what you're touching on is commitment. And by having that perspective of thinking of each other as maybe not permanence in each other's lives, but absolutely long-term and like family, it doubles down on that commitment and knowing that you're feeling that towards each other and that it is the two of you versus whatever problems are facing the company or your partnership, and that you're going to face that as a united front. And that's one of the core tenets of the Sound Relationship House. And that's all the elements of a very healthy, effective relationship. And the two weight-bearing walls are trust and commitment. And it sounds like you have both. And ideally, you'd have both in a family as well. And then, Jason, what you were saying on also knowing your needs and being able to communicate those, the first floor of that house is called love mapping. You can just think about it as mapping more generally. And it's knowing not only your needs, but the needs of your partner, as well as what are their other priorities outside of this company, even within the company, what gives them energy, what doesn't, where do they need to develop, where do they want to develop.
Yeah, I would say that resonates with what I was trying to communicate, which you clarified much better. But by the way, like once there's a foundation in place, that does open up the door to have more like direct and honest discussions. Like sibling fights or something can be quite rambunctious, right? It almost unlocks even tougher conversations more frequently, right? But hopefully in a way where you ultimately can make progress and move on and avoid long-term rifts and so forth, right? That might cause an employee to decide they want to move on or something like that, right?
I think that's exactly it. And I think managing conflict is floor 3 of the house. So you're exactly right that it's you build on that relationship, you have a foundation, and then you kind of build the trust to have a healthy disagreement. If you're open to sharing a time where you've had strong yet different opinions, I know we've been talking about you're both from a technical background. You do have similar, it sounds like, values and similar skill sets and a similar leadership style. It even sounds like in terms of how you hope to be running this company.
I'll tee it off by first talking about a time where we made a big decision that we actually had surprisingly firm alignment on, and then maybe Jason can set the stage for another type of discussion. So we did have a pivot in our company's history. We pivoted in a very hard way from being a vertical specific sort of application company that was providing, in our case, models, AI models to customers in different verticals like automotive and public safety, all the way to being an open source company that was giving software away for free with initially no way to make money at all. Now that sounds like a big pivot, and it was a big pivot, but that was actually something that Jason and I felt a lot of alignment on as we sort of took stock at the progress we were making and the learnings we were having about the market that we were serving and the response to our technology. We just felt very strongly that there was a much bigger opportunity to provide more of like an infrastructure tool from the bottom up within organizations than selling sort of outputs or products from the top down. But I think that kind of, it was us listening to the market and what it was telling us, and also had the added bonus of fitting our sort of personalities or how we like to build things. Like we're builders. And so the idea of selling or giving a product to builders matched our personality and interest and skill set probably better. And we, after all, understood that target market very well because we were in that market ourselves and had colleagues and friends in that market as well. All that to say, that was kind of a big decision, but I think that we kind of agreed to it.
I agree. And actually, I think it was even a little bit more of a high risk moment in our company's history than you may be alluding to, because like, if I recall correctly, we had something like 8 months of runway in the bank, and we were essentially planning to completely change the company. And I recall saying at that moment, to the team, like, this is what we think is the right way to go about it. Not really sure if we'll survive, to be successful. So let's just really have fun and do the best we can do right now, given this direction. And in fact, open sourcing was such a wise decision. I mean, it was kind of like, we could have gone either way.
A number of teams that I work with, one of the conversations that I help to facilitate is around how to choose when to pivot or when to, I guess, press the panic button is what I've called it with some clients, and really make that change, knowing that it will require additional change in the team structure and roles and responsibilities and be high risk. You don't know what the outcome is. So thinking back to that time before you knew that open sourcing was the right call and got data to validate that, what gave you conviction in making that decision together?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if there was a big red panic button in our space. In some sense, I think there was a slow burn over many months where, a lot of our earlier conviction was being tested. And I don't think either of us are really stubborn people or, in these discussions, in the sense that the data was accumulating over time that was suggesting our earlier plan was going to lead to a company that may have been okay, right? But it really wasn't the unlocking the impact that we wanted to have. And if I recall correctly, we were having pilot projects, pretty successful pilot projects with a number of pretty big organizations. But when it came time to convert those pilots into production contracts, there was a lot of apprehension to do that because of the ultimate user value the evidence wasn't there. And I think that for me, at least, that was the data point that was okay, we just got to get on the train that's in this direction. And it was a lot more than just open sourcing, right? We had to retool the entire organization, as you mentioned, right? We had hired around the idea of going in that direction, and we had built a set of technological capabilities around that direction. But what we realized was we needed to meet our users much earlier in the life cycle of building into these AI systems. We ultimately were trying to sell pretty late stage in some sense. You can think of it that way. And now we're much earlier stage, and throughout the life cycle of building an AI system, we were able to have that conviction that a pivot was right at this moment because of all of the user feedback, all the data we were getting. Frankly, maybe it was a few months later than it needed to be, for that matter. We had a lot of data, and I think that really drove us to the decision.
Yeah, I think Jason summarized it perfectly. That wasn't an easy decision because we were faced with the reality of having built a team and a company for a go-to-market that was too early, and the need to retool and refocus to provide a product that the market was ready for. And so that was a big bet for sure. I think personally, it felt correct to me. I think that there, like Jason was alluding to, there probably are multiple ways to enter in a given market, and you have to find the right way that you understand and that meets your own team skill set and DNA. In our case, that we're builders, and providing a product for builders was going to be the right way for us to find real product market fit. That was the best way for us to get to the first 10 users that loved our product, which gave us enough confidence to really double down on it and build it into a larger product and achieve traction and all the things that you're looking for when you're trying to find product market fit.
Yeah. And it also sounds like there was an alignment on the company that you both want to be building and the level of impact, that type of impact as well. And looking at our historical data, we're not going to reach that level of impact with this current business model or this current way we're going about it. And that can also lead to more conviction, an aligned conviction, because your North Star is the same.
Yeah, that was one case where our similarities helped us reach alignment earlier. So finding alignment between us was less of an issue than finding the right North Star for the market. But I pivoted us, no pun intended, away from your original question around the time where our alignment as founders was maybe not so easy. So happy to bring us back to that as well.
It is interesting. We have not had too many disagreements over the years. We have had some, early one that I brought up to Brian the other day that apparently he forgot, which was, it was something like a fundamental decision about how video objects are represented in the software stack. We had very different ways of doing it, and the first to the gun won in that case. That was not a great way to make a decision, but so other scenarios those that have come up where we have like mildly decided when we closed our Series A, I really wanted to hire essentially a recruiter or like a head of people. And, cause I knew as like the person who's leaning the less technical as a contributor to the company, like I was ultimately going to be in charge of not only sales, but also recruiting. And that just seemed to be like two things I wasn't really keen on doing. But ultimately, we were able to make a decision on that point pretty rapidly, right? Like, it was just not a sensible thing to do. Growing from however much we were, like 6 people to 20 people or 25 people, that does not a recruiter need in some sense. And the data itself spoke for itself there. Perhaps a different thing where we disagreed on, it's a hard thing for all founding teams, I think. Are you ready for fundraising? Right? Like when is an okay time to fundraise? There are macroeconomic conditions, there's ARR, there's like the size of the community. If you're open source, for example, or community driven, like so many variables in there. And like for every mentor or person you talk to, you get a rather different answer. I mean, there are some, like, obviously, like VCs have models, right? Like to go from X to Y, you need this much revenue and, with this much evidence and so on. But, I find like very few companies fit so nicely and neatly into those models, I think, right? So there's always an unknown. And I think one thing I've learned over the years working with Brian is that we may be similar in many ways, but we are fundamentally different in one key way, which is our underlying personality. Like, frankly, I'm INTP and Brian is INTJ, right? Like he wants his ducks in a row and he focuses on like very structured, outcome oriented things. I am way more loosey goosey, like, I can hand wave today, I'll hand wave tomorrow. And it was great. It's fine. Let's take a risk. It's okay to talk to more people. It's okay to release the software to the 6 billion people in the world if there's a few bugs in it. It's not a big deal. Like, we'll find them. We'll fix them over time. Like, so we have these different personalities. And I remember like we did disagree or in the past, like, are we ready to begin conversations around fundraising? We ultimately did like fundraise and here we are and so on. But it was definitely a sticky area.
Yeah. Maybe just to like unpack that a little bit more. So the decision was, should we fundraise now, noting that we have plenty of runway, we don't need to, or should we wait and have our traditionally agreed upon metrics for signaling you're ready for the next round to improve and then raise at that time? And so we sort of had to unpack the why behind each one, right? And as Jason mentioned, there could be macro reasons why it's a good time to raise right now, or you could try to time it with some big customer announcement, which we were having at that time. Or do you want to listen to some of the more of the conventional wisdom around the metrics that you should be going for to raise the next round? And well, why would you consider one versus the other? Well, it's a significant time investment to go out and do a fundraise, right? And you'll definitely gather more data. But if it results in, well, actually, let's just wait for another year or something, then that was a big time investment that didn't go to anything other than just gathering data for something we would do in the future, right? Or maybe it works and then, everything's great, right? And so that was for the two different sides of that coin, right? Now, one thing I would say just more on the tactical side, I think it's definitely a fallacy to assume that the sort of standard metrics that you tier for when a company should raise would ever apply to really anybody, right? Maybe it's some sort of median, but in reality, companies are all over the map and it's all about the storytelling at earlier stages, or maybe the right way to focus on the right metrics to really capture the opportunity that you're going after on the more quantitative side. So going after sort of like standard metrics, probably not a good idea. No deal is standard or normal in that sense. But in terms of how we navigated that disagreement, we probably started by not navigating it well at all, which was basically like not really agreeing, not like having the differences of opinions come to a head and making a very specific decision about, in fact, some of the feelings maybe weren't even expressed for a while. So some months would pass and then we'd have a discussion like, why aren't we fundraising or something, right? And then we revealed some more key data about like, well, actually, we think that there's a compelling reason on one hand that we should raise now. And then once we maybe got those perspectives more out in the open, then we had something we could actually work with where we're not just trying to deal with some uncertain problem, but we could try to evaluate the specific reasons for and against and just have more clarity on, okay, as of today, we have made a specific decision. We're going to fundraise now, or we're going to wait for something very concrete that we can then seek to measure instead of leaving it sort of unsettled in a way that's just bad conflict resolution.
That's interesting. It sounds like there was almost this problem space where you're identifying the problem and the elements that you need. I'm thinking like getting more shared data in and getting more on the same page on what is actually informing that decision. And then there's the decision itself or the solution, the path forward. And for something like fundraising, it's very easy to understand, okay, the two options are we either fundraise now or we fundraise later, and get stuck in the position of like, which one do I want to do more? And it takes a lot of reflection to take a step back and say, well, what are our interests driving that? What's our data driving that? And having a conversation in that space and getting clear on what those constraints are to then inform which position is best for us right now is a really important process. By the end of that data exploration, did you feel on the same page? Or were there still differences in opinion and it was more of a, okay, let's test this out and here's what we need to see in order to continue on this path?
Well, I think we had a partially data-driven agreement based on internal data and willingness to invest the time now. But we also did go out and have some early conversations that were additional sort of external or extrinsic data that really did, I think, ultimately informed not only when, but also how we ultimately went about the raise. And we were able to have very good conversations based on those internal and external data for sure.
It's interesting. I think fundraising in particular, especially earlier stage, maybe the most important ingredient you need is probably just really strong conviction. And so maybe the right data would come in the form of like, oh, someone else just raised this round. Well, we've got to be fundraising now. There's no question, right? Or just like a great conversation that we maybe had with an advisor or someone where we really felt like something clicked in terms of how to convey the story. Data's good, but I think waiting around for a lot of concrete data for some key things like fundraising events actually may not be as important. It's probably more about just the conviction to go out and do it, get it done.
I'm also hearing that there's a really important element of that data collection. It's not necessarily waiting for the data to be perfect, but it's that it's shared. So the fact that both of you are on a certain advisor call so that there's not an asymmetry of information when there is a big decision that needs to be made. From a workflow perspective, for folks who are making big decisions and might be approaching that from different perspectives with their co-founders, increasing the amount of shared data, whether that's getting both people on advisory calls or sharing deals that are happening in the market, but investing in that and making sure that you're kind of in lockstep there, as well as it sounds like there was a series of conversations over time. And so you didn't wait until the very last minute when you were like, it's either now or never. You allowed there to be time to reach that shared decision, to collect that data and have those discussions, which is still urgent, but maybe less urgent than it would have been if you had continued to punt that.
Yeah, definitely. In general, if you are forced into a decision because there's no other option, that's not a position that you want to put yourself in any situation.
A good lesson. I always like to close out my conversations asking, what is one invaluable piece of advice for teams like yours? So in this circumstance, maybe a faculty-student pair that's starting a company, what is a piece of advice that maybe you didn't receive that you wish you did and that you can gift back to teams that are just starting?
I can go first, I guess. As a career academic, you get into things and you have a sense for what they're going to yield and what they're going to be like. But I think it would have been nice if someone had hinted to me that if you really want to be an operator in the company and not like the typical one day a week or whatever, like really do the company and be very involved, it is very unrelated to academic life. It's a whole new ballgame. You really have to be willing to learn new things. I mean, I guess I did that, but at the same time, it would have been great to know what I was getting into in some sense a little bit more.
Yeah. And maybe I'd add to that from the student perspective, if you are going to do a student faculty leave that relationship at the door on day one and think of yourself as partners, because that's really what you are. And it plays into what Jason was saying, that now your responsibility is to operate a business and not to just focus on R&D or something like that. Because if you're building great tech and then going and searching for a market, that's going to be a bad recipe in general, which maybe is a more universally applicable piece of advice for two technical co-founders, right? You can never talk to enough customers. You should always talk to 10 customers before you build anything, because your objective is to find a very small number of people that absolutely love what it is that you're building, and work towards that first, instead of building something that you think is cool and your co-founder thinks is cool, and then going to see if anybody will buy it. That's not going to help you.
I think those are great pieces of advice. And both of them, I would guess, are easier said than done, which also speaks to your success because you've done both of those things very well. So congratulations for that, and very excited to continue following your team's journey and your company's journey.
Great. Thank you, Annie. This was very fun.
Thanks, Annie.
Hey, thanks for listening to the show this week. Please make sure to click the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode of the show. I'm Annie Garofalo, and thank you for listening to How I Met My Co-Founder.